Many times a syndication or an investment fund isn't just one sponsor coming together to do this, to find investors, to do the whole projects. It's two or three. Sometimes you're doing what's called a joint venture where multiple parties are participating as the GP or the sponsor or the manager, however you want to call it for yourself. And exactly how do you do a joint venture agreement? What are those key tips to make sure the joint venture is successful so that at the end of the day, investors are happy and keep investing with you, one of the sponsors? One of the reasons we talk about joint ventures is because they happen a lot, right? So you've got one team that's very good at one thing. So for example, it might be something about, well, we're very good at finance and identifying projects and opportunities, but we're not so good at developing itself and actually doing those projects. But the people who we want to be developers want to be involved and be part of the GP as well for their own needs. That's called a joint venture, when the two groups come together or three groups come together for that common purpose. When that common purpose also has passive investors coming in, then it's still an investment, it's still a syndication, right? It's still considered a security. Just this portion here that's the general partnership, because everybody's very actively involved, is not the security. What's the security is the passive people who have come in as part of it. Now, there are multiple different things to keep in mind in making sure that it all works well. I've got 5 different tips that I think are going to help you with your own joint venture as part of a syndication or investment fund. One thing, when you're doing that syndication with joint venture partners, that you gotta do is each one of the parties needs to have clearly identified roles and responsibilities. What are they doing? What are their contributions? Now, I've done other videos, and we can link to that here, about talking about roles and responsibilities. But the other thing that has to be thought of is what's the contribution, right? That needs to be clearly identified. If one group is coming up with all the cash, the second group probably needs to know that as well as the first group. They need to know who's contributing what. Not only in terms of dollars, though. Also, what's very important is the contributions of time. Is this one group going to be doing all the finding of the asset? Is this group going to be doing all of the development? Are they only doing a piece of it? Whatever those things are, you want to think through them, identify them, and incorporate them into your joint venture agreement so ultimately you can make it successful. Part of this too is coming up with the key components that are part of the joint venture agreement. So once you've identified, kind of those roles and responsibilities, we also need to go through those components that just are necessarily there. Foremost on everybody's mind is profit sharing. Exactly how are profits going to be split between everyone? Are these people's expenses going to get paid or not? Is it just a straight percentage? How is that percentage divided up? What does that look like? It could be a lot of different things, but it needs to be able to be something that everybody knows about, has agreed to ahead of time, before it's 6 months later, 1 year later, and then there's some dispute over it. Well, no, we were going to be splitting profits 50-50. Well, no, but that was after expenses that I had, or whatever it is. It needs to be taken care of up front. It should be in your joint venture agreement. Also, there is management responsibilities. Who's involved with the pieces of the puzzle itself? Who's the one that makes the decisions on behalf of the joint venture? Is one group going to make all of those decisions and the other people are just active participants, kind of under their direction? Or does it look something more like, well, we're each going to decide mutually? And if there's a dispute over those, how are those going to get resolved? Lastly, how is the exit going to take place for the joint venture itself? Who makes the decision on timing? How does it actually get structured? Who's responsible for what? Those things are all key components of that joint venture agreement. There are legal considerations when we're thinking about joint ventures as well. Certainly structurally, that's a big one. Most of the time, I like to put the joint venture participants themselves, so each of those individual GPs, the 2 or 3 or however many people coming together, underneath its own LLC. I do that because I find it easier to manage the other components when we've got sort of an operating agreement as the main body, the main working document, rather than a joint venture agreement. This is a stylistic thing. It's not actually critical whether you use this particular style or whether it's a joint venture style. That's just my general preference. I like to do it that way. It also obscures for the investors who don't need to know how that relationship works. If I have a situation where I've got a joint venture and I don't do that, there's going to be some visibility to the investors on how money's getting split up, how roles and responsibilities are getting split up. I find that not to be as advantageous. Investors want to be able to think, okay, I've given this my money to this, it's all working for me, yay. They don't want to get caught up in the drama between different joint venturers. So the other thing that we obviously need to think about is when we've got that structure is compliance rules. We need to make sure that that joint venture didn't inadvertently create a security amongst other of the joint venturers, which most of the time is doable to do, but we need to define the roles and responsibilities to make sure that nobody's taking just a passive role. The investment of money, the expectation of profit, relying on the work of another, that's the definition of a security. If this person is coming in as a joint venture and they're just giving money and expecting some sort of profit, it's a security. It's not a joint venture. We've got a problem here, and that needs to be dealt with ahead of time. And lastly, we need to make sure that the drafting of the document goes along in a way that all of the parties understand what those different components are, how they fit together, so nobody feels like, well, I wasn't a part of the conversation at the beginning. So with all these different things coming together, why would you do a joint venture? Well, obviously it's to pool resources, right? It's to pool resources, and I don't just mean money. It's also expertise. It's also investors. Those people come together. When you're putting together a larger team that is a joint venture, you need to make sure all the pieces are there, and many times we can do that through the joint venture so everybody feels some autonomy from each other, but they also feel like they're getting their what they deserve and what their contribution is. So that pooling of resources is a huge benefit of doing it. Another really is sharing that expertise. You may have a lot of expertise in putting these deals together, but you don't have expertise in the specific asset class, or you don't have the specific expertise in some component of it that you wish that you had. By doing a joint venture, again, you're having parties come together and you're taking advantage of that expertise for the whole syndication, which ultimately goes to the investors. There's also a sharing of the risks. As if you're sharing in the costs of putting things together and the time you're putting in together, if everything dies and falls flat, well, each of you may have contributed 50% of what you would have initially contributed to it, and so there's less lost at the end of the day. So what's the downside? Well, first off, there are some risks to it. Most importantly is misaligned objectives. Now, this should have been taken care of by putting together a proper joint venture agreement. If you're doing that, you probably have identified along the way what each of your team's objectives are. We want objectives to be mutually aligned. We don't want them to be at cross purposes. Otherwise, why are we even doing this deal together in the first place? But we need to make sure that we've got those objectives that are good, not only for short term, but also for long term. I want to put this deal together because it's going to help us transform into a very large REIT with this. Well, that could be very different from, well, we want to stay small and nimble and we want to do, this and just maximize the amount of profit or whatever it is. Those could be misaligned, and it's helpful to identify that ahead of time. There's also a risk of dependency. So we may have a situation where one of the joint venturers is completely dependent on the other. This isn't a situation because you put that one party in a position where they really need the other more than the first guy does. All right, so we need to create a situation where there's a plan to really raise the level of all the joint venturers so that they're mutually satisfied. Now, in one deal, maybe it's not so important, but by deal 2 or 3, very important to do this. It is a risk and it is a problem. And lastly, it is more complex to manage a joint venture because you've got, not only are you managing a set of investors that all have some autonomy built into them, and so that can be a potential risk. Now, that all being said, it oftentimes makes sense to do a joint venture inside of a syndication and an investment fund. If you need help putting that together, my name is Tilden Moschetti. I am a syndication attorney, and we work with syndicators, investment funds, to put together deals and structure deals in a way that really makes their clients money, makes their investors money, but also makes you a lot of money as well. And we have the expertise of having put together so many joint ventures, working in joint ventures with boots on the ground experience as well, because I've done that for myself, and we can help you with that process too. If you'd like to talk about your project, don't hesitate to give us a call, send us an email, get in touch, and we can set up a meeting to go through what you're working on.